There exists a moment in every civilization's history when the gods stop listening. For humanity in the 41st millennium, that moment lasted exactly 17 seconds, 400 milliseconds, and in those heartbeats of cosmic silence, 10,000 years of faith died screaming. Tech adept Valen Korith had monitored the Golden Throne's vital functions for 3 centuries without witnessing a single anomaly. The sacred readouts had remained constant through the birth and death of stars, through the rise and fall of entire Space Marine chapters, through wars that consumed billions of lives. The Emperor's psychic signature was as reliable as the laws of physics themselves, until the morning it simply wasn't. The first indication wasn't an alarm or a warning klaxon. It was silence, the kind of absolute soul-crushing quiet that exists only in the void between galaxies, now somehow present in the heart of humanity's most sacred chamber. Korith's mechadendrites convulsed as his instruments registered the impossible. Zero psychic resonance from the master of mankind. For 17 seconds, the immortal beacon that had guided humanity through 10 millennia of darkness ceased to exist. The Golden Throne, that magnificent prison of suffering and sacrifice, sat empty of divine presence while its desiccated occupant slumped deeper into mechanisms that suddenly felt more like a tomb than a life support system. Captain General Trajan Valoris, commander of the Custodian Guard, felt his genetically enhanced heart stop beating for those same 17 seconds. Around the throne chamber, warriors who had never known fear in 10,000 years of service suddenly understood what mortals meant when they spoke of existential terror. The Emperor wasn't just unconscious or weakened. He was gone, leaving behind only cooling flesh and the echo of divinity rapidly fading from reality. But the true horror wasn't the absence itself. It was what rushed in to fill the void. In the deepest layers of the warp, things older than human civilization stirred with predatory hunger, sensing opportunity in the sudden darkness where once there had been blinding light. The barriers between dimensions, maintained by sheer force of the Emperor's will, began to crack like glass under pressure. When the beacon reignited, its return felt different, strained, desperate, like a man gasping for air after nearly drowning. The psychic shriek that followed would haunt every living psyker in the galaxy, a sound that spoke of cosmic agony and the price of godhood measured in eternal suffering. In the command centers of 1,000 worlds, astropaths collapsed with blood streaming from their augmented eye sockets, all speaking the same terrified whisper: "He can die. The God Emperor can die." The unthinkable had become reality, and in that revelation, the very foundation of human civilization began to crumble. Subscribe now and witness the galaxy's darkest hour. Because when gods bleed, mortals pay the price in ways that will forever change what it means to have faith. Across the vastness of the galaxy, the 17 seconds of silence echoed like a death knell through every sanctioned psyker's mind. On Vos Prime, astropath Tertius Malachar was mid-transmission when the Astronomican died, his message to the Cadian Gate suddenly severed as if reality itself had been cut with a blade. The psychic backlash tore through his augmented nervous system like molten adamantium, leaving him convulsing on the transmitting chamber floor, blood streaming from his sealed eye sockets. The astropathic choir of Segmentum Solar felt it worst of all. Hundreds of psychically gifted souls, their lives dedicated to carrying the Emperor's messages across impossible distances, collapsed in unison as their connection to the divine beacon shattered. The choir mistress, ancient beyond measure and wired into the choir chamber's life support systems, screamed a single word that would haunt the survivors: abandoned. On distant Ultramar, the fortress of Hera's astropathic sanctum became a charnel house in seconds. 12 robed figures, their minds linked in perfect harmony to relay Guilliman's strategic commands, suddenly found themselves alone in the warp's infinite darkness. Without the Emperor's light to guide them, they were exposed to horrors that mortal consciousness was never meant to endure. 3 died instantly from psychic shock. The rest wished they had. The ripple effects cascaded through the Imperium's communication network like a virus. Sector commands lost contact with their outlying systems. Forge worlds found themselves unable to coordinate with their mining colonies. The delicate web of astropathic relays that bound humanity's scattered empire together began to unravel, each severed connection leaving entire worlds isolated in the void. Chief astropath Vex Corvanis of the Black Ships felt his charges, unsanctioned psychers bound for Terra's soul furnaces, suddenly grow quiet in their restraint cells. For the first time in decades of shepherding these unfortunate souls, he heard something more terrifying than their usual madness: perfect, absolute silence. The warp-touched prisoners had felt the Emperor's absence more keenly than anyone, and their sudden stillness spoke of cosmic horror beyond imperial comprehension. When the beacon returned, the astropaths who survived the ordeal were forever changed. They spoke in whispers of the 17 seconds when they had been truly alone, cut off from the Emperor's grace and exposed to the raw malevolence of the warp. Many would never transmit again, their minds too scarred by the brief taste of absolute abandonment. The Imperium's communication network, rebuilt over millennia of careful coordination, would take months to fully restore. But the psychological damage to humanity's psychic servants would never heal. In the darkness of space, Imperial vessels found themselves suddenly blind, their navigators screaming warnings that would chill the blood of even the most hardened voidsmen. The Senatorum Imperialis had not convened in emergency session for 3 centuries. Now, within hours of the catastrophe, the most powerful figures in the Imperium gathered in the Hall of Judgment, their faces masks of barely controlled terror. Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum, High Admiral of the Imperial Navy, Master of the Administratum, all the High Lords of Terra sat in their ancient thrones, staring at readings that defied comprehension. Fabricator General Udia Raskian spoke first, his vox grill crackling with static as he presented the Mechanicus analysis. The psychic resonance cascade measured 10.7 on the Keeler scale. For reference, the opening of the Eye of Terror registered 9.2. His servo-skull familiars projected hololithic data streams that painted the chamber in sickly green light. The Emperor's psychic signature experienced complete cessation for exactly 17 seconds, 400 milliseconds. Grand Master Voldus of the Grey Knights, summoned via emergency astropathic relay before the communications blackout, stood like a statue of righteous fury. His nemesis force sword remained sheathed, but psychic frost rimmed his ornate armor. The prognosticars speak of worse to come. The warp bleeds through reality's wounds. We have detected 17 separate demonic incursions in the Sol system alone. Ecclesiarch Deasis VII's ornate robes trembled as he clutched his rosarius. The faithful cry out for answers we cannot provide. Shrine worlds report mass hysteria. On Ophelia 7, 10,000 pilgrims fell to their knees and would not rise again. They speak of emptiness where the Emperor's love should be. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex, his scarred face bearing the weight of countless battles against chaos, leaned forward. The cults are moving. Every heretic cell we've spent decades monitoring has activated simultaneously. They sense weakness like carrion feeders scenting death. His bionic eye whirred as it focused on the assembled lords. The traitor legions stir in the eye. Our deep cover operatives report massive warp fleet movements. Admiral Quarren of Battlefleet Solar stood rigid at attention. We've lost contact with 47 vessels in the immediate aftermath. Navigation is unreliable. The warp routes that have served us for millennia now show dangerous fluctuations. The navigators speak of false currents in the Imperium. The temperature in the chamber dropped perceptibly as Captain General Trajan Valoris finally spoke. The leader of the Adeptus Custodes had witnessed the Emperor's condition firsthand, had felt the divine presence flicker like a dying candle. His Majesty endures, but something has changed. The Golden Throne's mechanisms show stress fractures that were not present before. We estimate, perhaps decades before another such event becomes catastrophic. The silence that followed was absolute. Decades. In a realm where wars lasted millennia and patience was measured in centuries, decades felt like heartbeats. In the void between stars, the Imperium's vast fleets found themselves adrift in an ocean of nightmares. The Emperor-class battleship Dominus Eternal had been 3 days out from Cadia when the Astronomican died, her navigator house Belisarius suddenly screaming warnings that chilled even the most seasoned void-born crew. Navigator Primaris Lysander felt the warp currents shift beneath his vessel like a living thing in agony. Through his third eye, the realm of souls had always appeared as a turbulent sea lit by the Emperor's golden beacon, a lighthouse that never failed, never wavered, never left humanity's children lost in the dark. Now, for 17 seconds that stretched like eternity, he stared into absolute blackness, while things that should not exist pressed against the Geller field with hungry malevolence. "Emergency translation to real space," he screamed, his voice cracking with psychic strain. "Something comes, something vast and—" The navigator's words dissolved into inhuman shrieks as the warp touched his consciousness directly, without the Emperor's protection to shield his mortal mind. Captain Mordian Vex felt his ancient battleship shudder as it tore itself from the Imperium, emergency klaxons wailing throughout the massive vessel. Around them, the Dominus Eternal's escort fleet materialized in desperate confusion. 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 2 battle barges of the Iron Hands chapter, all fleeing the same cosmic horror. But they were not alone in the darkness. Across the galaxy, thousands of Imperial vessels found themselves stranded between stars, their navigators either dead, mad, or too traumatized to safely guide them home. The heavy cruiser, Righteous Fury, had been carrying reinforcements to the Damocles Gulf when her navigator house simply stopped functioning. 3 generations of psychic bloodline, bred specifically for warp travel, reduced to gibbering madness in minutes. Astropath Terminus Caius aboard the strike cruiser Emperor's Wrath had tried to send a distress signal when the beacon returned, but his message became a litany of horror. The deep warp stirs. Ancient things wake. The youngest god laughs. The eye opens wider. We are alone. We are alone. We are... The transmission cut to static as something in the warp devoured the psychic link entirely. Ship after ship reported the same phenomenon. During those 17 seconds of silence, the warp had changed. Familiar routes now led to unmarked systems where impossible geometries hurt to perceive. Safe passages that had served for millennia now pulsed with chaotic energy that corroded hull plating and drove crew members to self-mutilation. The merchant vessel, Blessed Acquisition, had been carrying supplies to the Tau border when her navigator detected what he described as wounds in reality itself, tears in the fabric of space-time that leaked raw chaos into the material universe. On 10,000 shrine worlds across the galaxy, faith itself began to crack like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Cardinal Voss of the Ophelia 7 Cathedral watched in horror as his most devout worshippers collapsed during evening prayers, their faces twisted not in ecstasy, but in existential terror. The massive golden aquila above the altar, that symbol of the Emperor's eternal vigilance, seemed somehow dimmed, as if the divine light that had always infused imperial iconography had been partially drained away. Sister Superior Magdalena of the Order of the Sacred Rose, felt it in her very bones as she led her squad through the hive Tertius Undercity. The sacred litanies that had always brought her comfort now tasted like ash in her mouth. Her bolt pistol, blessed by 3 different cardinals and inscribed with the Emperor's own words, felt cold and lifeless in her grip. "Sisters," she whispered to her squad, "do you feel different?" The response came as a chorus of quiet affirmation that sent ice through her veins. These were Adepta Sororitas warriors who had never wavered in their faith, who had charged demon princes while singing hymns of praise. Yet now, something fundamental had shifted in their connection to the divine. In the great ecclesiarchy seminary on Vos Prime, Confessor Matthias discovered his students weeping over their prayer books. The sacred texts remained unchanged, every word of imperial doctrine exactly as it had been written over millennia, but the meaning seemed hollow now, like beautiful vessels drained of their precious contents. "The Emperor protects," one young acolyte whispered, the traditional phrase sounding more like a desperate question than a statement of faith. The pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed the Imperium witnessed unprecedented scenes of despair. On the shrine world of Dimamar, 10,000 faithful who had journeyed for decades to witness the miraculous weeping icon found themselves staring at a statue that no longer wept sacred tears. The golden droplets that had fallen for 3 centuries, proof of the Emperor's eternal sorrow for humanity's suffering, had simply stopped. The pilgrims knelt in the dust, some praying harder, others beginning to doubt everything they had ever believed. Most disturbing were the reports from the Schola Progenium facilities, young orphans being trained for imperial service. Children whose pure faith had never been tainted by doubt began experiencing night terrors. They spoke of dreams where the Emperor's face was hidden in shadow, where his voice could not reach them, where they felt truly abandoned in an uncaring universe. The Ministerum's response was swift, but revealed their own underlying panic. Emergency sermons were scheduled, additional prayer sessions mandated, and the faithful were urged to demonstrate their devotion through increased offerings. But privately, the clergy whispered of signs and portents that matched no known prophecy in the imperial creed. In the deepest shadows of the Imperium, creatures that had hidden for decades suddenly stirred with predatory hunger. The cult of the Crimson Dawn, operating from the sewers beneath Hive Primus on Necromunda, felt the Emperor's moment of weakness like a clarion call. Magus Vex Mortalis, his body a patchwork of self-inflicted scars and blasphemous tattoos, raised his arms in rapture as the warp whispered promises of ascension. "Brothers, sisters, the false emperor falters." His voice echoed through the abandoned hab blocks where his followers gathered. Factory workers turned to chaos, ex-PDF soldiers bearing the mark of Slanesh, even fallen administratum clerks who had traded their souls for forbidden knowledge. "The moment of revelation is upon us. Let the galaxy burn." On the agri-world of Mordant Prime, the servants of decay emerged from plague pits they had been preparing for 17 years. Plague Marines of the Death Guard had seeded this world with Nurgle's gifts long ago, waiting for the perfect moment to harvest their corruption. Now, with the Emperor's light dimmed, the time had come. Noxious blooms erupted from grain fields as demon engines clawed their way up from underground bunkers. The response was immediate and terrifying. Vox transmissions across the galaxy carried the same message, spoken in 1,000 different tongues, but bearing identical corruption. The throne cracks. The light dies. Embrace the dark gods and know true freedom. These weren't random acts of rebellion. This was coordinated heresy on a scale that suggested planning spanning millennia. On the Forge world of Lucius, tech adept Hereticus Vaughn had spent decades corrupting machine spirits with scrap code viruses. As servitors across the planet began chanting blasphemous canticles in binary, He activated sleeper protocols that turned manufacturing centers into demon engine foundries. The very machines that had served the Omnissiah for thousands of years now twisted into instruments of the dark Mechanicum. But most chilling were the word-bearers operating from the ghoul stars. Dark Apostle Erebus himself had prepared contingencies for this day, establishing hidden cells on 100 worlds throughout the eastern fringe. When the beacon flickered, his followers began their work with religious fervor, not the clean devotion of the imperial creed, but the twisted passion of those who served gods that answered their prayers with gifts of mutation and madness. The imperial response was hampered by the very communications blackout that had enabled the heretics' coordination. PDF commanders found themselves fighting insurgencies on dozens of worlds simultaneously, cut off from reinforcement requests. Local Arbites precincts reported mass riots as hidden cultists revealed themselves, their blasphemous symbols painted in blood across imperial monuments. The whisper had become a roar. The Emperor's will was broken, and in that crack, darkness flooded through. While mortal faith wavered and heretics celebrated, the Adeptus Astartes stood like adamantium pillars in a hurricane of doubt. On the fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, Chapter Master Tor Garadon felt the same psychic tremor that had shattered lesser minds, but his response was immediate and uncompromising. "Brothers, to your posts. The Emperor tests us, and we shall not be found wanting." The Space Marines had been created for moments like this, where ordinary humans collapsed into despair or turned to heresy. The Astartes remained functional, their psycho-indoctrination and centuries of battle conditioning providing stability in a galaxy gone mad. In the depths of the Eternal Crusader, High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars called his most veteran warriors to the chapter's greatest relic chamber. "The Emperor's champions do not falter." His voice carried absolute conviction as he knelt before the preserved power sword of Sigismund himself. "If the galaxy has forgotten his strength, we shall remind them. If mortals lose faith, we become that faith incarnate. Ready the fleet, we hunt heretics." On Baal, Dante felt the weight of his 500 years pressing upon him like never before. The Lord Commander of the Blood Angels had witnessed the return of Primarch Guilliman, had stood beside the Emperor's sons as they rebuilt the Imperium. Now, as reports of chaos flooded in from across the galaxy, he made a decision that would reshape the chapter's destiny. "All companies, immediate mobilization," he commanded, his ancient voice carrying the authority of millennia. The successor chapters are recalled. Every son of Sanguinius will answer this call. The Blood Angels' fortress monastery became a hive of activity as centuries-old battle brothers prepared for what might be their final crusade. The Iron Hands, ever practical in their approach to warfare, had already begun calculating casualty projections and resource allocation. Clan Captain Cardan Stronos reviewed the tactical data with mechanical precision. 17 seconds of Imperial communications blackout had resulted in approximately 47 separate heretic uprisings across their patrol sectors. The mathematics were clear. Maximum force, applied with surgical precision, would minimize long-term damage to Imperial infrastructure. On Nocturne, the Salamanders had turned their forges to full production, crafting weapons and armor for the mortal defenders who would need their protection. Chapter. Master Tushan personally oversaw the blessing of each bolt shell, each lasgun power pack, knowing that the coming war would be won or lost by the courage of ordinary humans backed by Astartes' support. The Ultramarines, still reeling from their Primarch's absence on campaign, nonetheless responded with the tactical flexibility that had made them legend. Captain Titus of the Second Company coordinated with 3 other captains to establish rapid response protocols that could counter heretic activities across an entire segmentum. In the void between stars, the space wolves howled their defiance. Deep within the sacred forges of Mars, the Adeptus Mechanicus turned their vast computational networks toward a problem that threatened the very foundation of their beliefs. Tech Dominus Cawl himself had withdrawn to his private sanctum, his ancient consciousness interfacing directly with the most powerful cogitators the Mechanicus had ever constructed. The calculations he performed would have driven mortal minds to madness, but for a being more machine than flesh, they represented the ultimate test of faith and logic. Magos Biologis. Hexmark watched the data streams with mounting horror as probability matrices cascaded across his visual feeds. The psychic resonance patterns suggest a 23.7% structural integrity loss in the Emperor's connection to the Golden Throne, he reported to the assembled tech priests, his vox grill crackling with static. At current degradation rates, we project total systemic failure within 847.3 standard Terran years. The silence that followed was broken only by the mechanical whirring of servo skulls and the steady pulse of life support systems. For beings who thought in millennia, 847 years was barely a heartbeat. Fabricator General Audia Raskian processed this information through 17 different analytical frameworks, each one confirming the same terrifying conclusion. The Omnissiah's physical form was failing at an accelerating rate. Tech Adept Vexmore had spent the last 6 hours analyzing the warp energy fluctuations recorded during the 17-second blackout. His findings painted a picture that challenged every assumption the Mechanicus held about the nature of their God Emperor. The psychic emanation patterns do not match baseline Imperial records, he reported, his mechadendrites twitching with agitation. There is contamination in the signal. Something else touched the throne during the silence. The implications were staggering. If the Emperor, the Omnissiah made flesh, could be corrupted or influenced by outside forces, then the entire technological theology of Mars came under question. Ancient protocols, locked away since the dark age of technology, were suddenly relevant again, as the tech priests realized they might need to prepare for a future without their divine patron. Magos Dominus Xenatal worked feverishly to recalibrate the Mechanicus's most sacred machines. The standard template constructs, the Arc Mechanicus vessels, even the basic cogitator systems that govern daily life on Forge worlds, all of it depended on maintaining connection to the Emperor's will through the noosphere. If that connection continued to degrade, the technological foundation of the Imperium would crumble into electronic chaos. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports from the deepest vaults of Mars, where the most ancient and forbidden technologies were stored. Machine spirits that had slumbered for millennia were suddenly active, their data prayers shifting from praise of the Omnissiah to something darker, more complex. The darkness spread like a plague across the Imperium's outer reaches, consuming entire systems in waves of madness and despair. On the frontier world of Cassis VII, Governor Mordian Holt watched from his palace spire as his capital city tore itself apart. Without the Emperor's light to guide them, the population had descended into a primal panic that stripped away 10,000 years of Imperial civilization in mere hours. The breakdown began with the astropathic choir, when the sanctioned psychers in the governor's palace died screaming, their death cries echoing through the Vox network. The common citizens knew something fundamental had changed. Within hours, mob violence erupted across 3 hive cities as desperate populations turned on anyone they perceived as different: mutants, off-worlders, even those whose faith seemed insufficiently pure. Colonel Thane Vectis of the Cassis PDF tried to maintain order, but his own troops were deserting in droves. "They speak of dreams," he reported to the governor in his final transmission. "Nightmares where the Emperor's face is replaced by something else. The men won't hold their positions. They say the darkness is alive and hungry, On the agri-world of Mordant's Rest, the very soil rebelled against imperial authority. Chaos corruption, seeded years ago by word-bearer infiltrators, erupted from contaminated grain fields like festering wounds. Demon engines burst from underground bunkers, while plague winds carried Nurgle's gifts across continents. The planetary PDF, already demoralized by the loss of astropathic communication, crumbled when faced with literal manifestations of their worst fears. The mining world of Zerion Prime reported similar horrors. Deep core excavations that had operated safely for centuries suddenly broke through into something that shouldn't exist. Vast caverns filled with crystalline growths that sang in frequencies that drove human minds to madness. The miners who emerged spoke of music beneath the world before turning their industrial equipment against their fellow workers. But it was on the shrine world of Dimmermar that the true scope of the catastrophe became clear. Cardinal Vex watched in horror as pilgrims who had traveled decades to reach the sacred sites began defiling the very monuments they had come to venerate. The weeping icon of Saint Celestine, which had shed tears of liquid gold for 3 centuries, cracked down the middle as thousands of the faithful pressed against it, not in worship, but in rage at their perceived abandonment. The spiral of collapse accelerated with each passing hour. Hive cities reported complete breakdown of social order. Forge worlds detected massive corruption in their machine spirits. Even Space Marine recruitment worlds found their populations turning away from the trials and tests that had once been considered the highest honor. The Imperium was bleeding from 10,000 wounds, each one a world where hope had died and humanity's oldest enemies stirred to claim their prize. The response of the Ordo Malleus was as swift as it was brutal. Across the galaxy, Inquisitors who had spent decades hunting the Emperor's enemies suddenly found their worst nightmares made manifest. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex stood in the command sanctum of his fortress ship, Triumph of Faith, studying tactical displays that painted the Imperium in bleeding crimson. 47 confirmed demonic incursions in the first 6 hours. The numbers climbed exponentially with each passing minute. "Launch the Grey Knights," Rex commanded, his scarred face set in grim determination. "Priority Alpha protocols. Every battle brother who can still draw breath." The demon hunters of Titan had been created for moments like this, when the warp's malevolent entities found cracks in reality wide enough to pour through. Now those cracks were becoming chasms. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax materialized through teleporter relay aboard the strike cruiser Hammer of Heretics, her psychic null field immediately calming the vessel's machine spirits. The ship had been translating through the warp when the Astronomican failed, and residual warp taint clung to every surface like psychic frost. "Status report," she demanded of the ship's captain, her voice cutting through the background chatter of terrified crew members. "Ma'am, we've detected 17 separate chaos signatures across the segmentum obscurus. The largest reads as greater demon manifestation on the forge world of Lucius." The captain's hands shook as he delivered the report. "Grand Master Voldus requests immediate support. The demon is... it's corrupting the planet's machine spirits through direct interface." On Cadia's ruined surface, the few remaining fortresses reported demon sightings increasing by 300% since the blackout. Inquisitor Lord Torquemada Coteaz personally led a strike team into the depths of Kasser Mirak, where something that called itself the Whisper of Endings had begun converting loyal guardsmen into willing servants of the dark gods. The ancient Inquisitor's demon hammer crackled with psychic energy as he advanced through corridors that had begun bleeding real blood from their walls. The most disturbing reports came from the Inquisition's own facilities. On the fortress moon of Gathalamor, Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor Bronislaw discovered that 3 of his own interrogators had turned traitor during the 17 seconds of silence. They spoke of seeing the truth behind the lie before opening fire on their former colleagues with weapons blessed by the ecclesiarchy itself. But it was the Ordo Xenos that provided the most chilling intelligence. Deep-range auger arrays detected massive movement in the ghoul stars, where things older than the Imperium itself stirred in response to the Emperor's moment of weakness. Inquisitor Cryptman's final transmission before his expedition went dark spoke of geometric impossibilities and predators that feed on faith itself. The war against chaos had begun in earnest, and the Imperium's greatest defenders found themselves fighting on 10,000 fronts simultaneously. Above the burning world of Ophelia VII, a miracle descended from the warp-torn skies. Saint Celestine, the living saint of the Adepta Sororitas, manifested in a blaze of golden fire that cut through the darkness like a blade of pure faith. Her ardent blade sang as she swept down upon the heretic hordes that had overrun the cathedral cities, her Gemini superior flanking her with weapons that blazed with righteous fury. The sight of the Emperor's chosen warrior restored hope to hearts that had known only despair. Sister Superior Magdalena, leading the last defenders of the Sacred Heart Convent, felt her faith surge back like a dam bursting. "The saint! The living saint comes!" Her voice carried across the Vox network, and suddenly bolters that had felt cold and lifeless blazed with renewed purpose. Celestine's arrival was not mere spectacle. It was a declaration of war against the forces that sought to capitalize on the Emperor's moment of weakness. Her blade carved through demon flesh as if it were mere smoke, while her voice rose in hymns that made the very air burn with holy light. "Children of the Emperor," she called to the embattled faithful below. "His light may flicker, but it shall never die. Stand fast, fight on. Victory is ours by divine right." The effect was immediate and transformative. Across Ophelia VII, Imperial forces that had been retreating in disorder suddenly turned to face their enemies with renewed determination. The PDF troopers who had abandoned their positions returned, their lasguns glowing with sanctified energy. Even the planetary governor, who had been preparing to evacuate to his orbital fortress, took up arms and marched to the front lines. But Celestine's greatest miracle came when she confronted the demon prince that had been leading the assault on the primary cathedral. The entity, manifested through the sacrifice of 10,000 corrupted souls, towered above the saint like a mountain of writhing flesh and bone. Its voice was the sound of civilizations dying, its presence a negation of everything pure and hopeful in the galaxy. "False saint!" the demon roared, its words tearing reality itself. "Your God abandons you. We felt his weakness. Soon all will know the truth of his mortality." Celestine's response was not words, but action. She ascended toward the demon prince in a spiral of golden fire, her blade leaving trails of light that lingered in the air like calligraphy written in starfire. When the two forces met, the impact shattered windows across 3 hive cities and sent shockwaves through the warp itself. For 17 seconds, the same duration as the Emperor's silence, the two beings fought in perfect stalemate. Then Celestine spoke a single word that none heard but all felt in their souls: faith. The demon prince exploded into fragments of shadow and regret, its death cry echoing across dimensions. The skies above Terra split like rotting fruit, revealing a wound in reality that pulsed with malevolent life. The Great Rift, that scar across the galaxy left by Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, had found a new vector of expansion, following the psychic shockwaves of the Emperor's momentary silence directly to humanity's birth world. From the depths of the Imperium, something vast and hungry pressed against the barriers between dimensions. Custodian Guard Captain Trajan Valoris felt the temperature drop 50 degrees in seconds as he stood vigil beside the Golden Throne. The ancient mechanisms that had sustained the Emperor for 10 millennia began emitting harmonics that resonated in frequencies no human ear should perceive. Warning runes blazed to life across every surface as the warp storm above Terra grew from an anomaly into an existential threat. "All custodian guard to battle stations," he commanded through the Vox network, his voice carrying the weight of ultimate authority. "The palace is under assault by forces beyond the material realm. Stand ready to die for the master of mankind." Around him, the most elite warriors in human history moved with practiced efficiency, their guardian spears crackling with barely contained energy. High above in the orbital defense platforms, Admiral Quarren watched through auger displays as reality literally unraveled before his eyes. Ships of Battlefleet Solar reported their Geller fields fluctuating wildly as warp energy bled through into normal space. The massive defense laser arrays of the Phalanx began cycling up to full power, but their targeting cogitators couldn't acquire locks on entities that existed partially outside dimensional space. The true horror became apparent when the storm began spawning lesser rifts throughout the Sol system. On Mars, tech priests reported massive demon incursions in the deepest forge complexes. Luna's weapon foundries fell silent as their machine spirits screamed in binary cant before going completely dark. Even the mighty fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists began registering warp entity manifestations within their most sacred chambers. But the greatest shock came when astropathic stations across Terra detected something impossible. A massive psychic presence moving within the warp storm itself. Not a demon prince or greater demon, but something older and more terrible. A fragment of one of the chaos gods themselves, drawn to Terra by the scent of the Emperor's momentary vulnerability. Space Marine strike cruisers from a dozen chapters converged on Terra as fast as their warp drives could carry them. The Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and even representatives from the secretive Grey Knights materialized in the Sol system to face a threat that could end humanity's greatest bastion. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists stood on the bridge of his battle barge, watching the writhing storm above humanity's birth world with grim determination. "If Terra falls," he whispered to his battle brothers, "then the dream of the Emperor dies with it. We hold here, whatever the cost." The call went out across the galaxy through every remaining astropathic relay, every functioning Vox transmitter, every shrine world and cathedral that could still reach the faithful. Terra needed their souls, not their bodies, not their weapons, not their ships, their very essence, freely given in the ultimate act of faith. The response was immediate and overwhelming, as billions of Imperial citizens made the same terrible choice. On Necromunda, hive worker Jorik Vex knelt before a crude shrine cobbled together from scrap metal and devotional candles. Around him, 10,000 other laborers had abandoned their shifts to join in desperate prayer. "Take my life," he whispered, the words echoing through the industrial cathedral. "Take my soul, if it will rekindle his light." The prayer was answered. His life force, along with those of his fellow workers, flowed through the warp toward Terra like golden rivers of sacrifice. The pilgrimage world of San Leor witnessed scenes of voluntary martyrdom that would become legend. Cardinal Voss led a procession of 100,000 faithful to the shrine of infinite sorrows, where each pilgrim placed their hands upon the sacred relic and offered themselves completely to the Emperor's service. Their deaths were not violent, but transcendent, each soul departing their body in a cascade of pure light that streamed directly toward the throne world. Sister Superior Magdalena stood before the assembled orders of the Adepta Sororitas on Ophelia 7, still bearing the scars of her battles against the demon hordes. "Sisters, we have served the Emperor with bolter and blade, with faith and fury. Now he asks for something greater, our very existence." The response was immediate and absolute. 10,000 battle sisters knelt as one, their power armor humming with holy energy as they channeled their life force through the warp to Terra. But perhaps the most profound sacrifice came from the Space Marines themselves. Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels, ancient beyond measure and weary of his long service, stood in the chapel of his fortress monastery. Around him, his most veteran warriors, sanguinary guard who had served for centuries, chaplains who had tended the spiritual needs of their battle brothers through countless wars, made the ultimate offering. "Our lives for the Emperor," Dante intoned, his voice carrying the weight of 1,500 years of faithful service. "Our souls for humanity." The psychic feedback was immediate and overwhelming as centuries of accumulated battle experience and spiritual devotion flowed through the warp toward the Golden Throne. On Terra itself, the effect was visible to every soul within the Sol system. The warp storm began to contract as waves of sacrificial energy struck it like focused lass fire. The rifts bleeding demon entities into real space sealed themselves one by one, pushed closed by the sheer weight of voluntary martyrdom. The Golden Throne's mechanisms, starved of psychic energy for crucial minutes, suddenly blazed with power beyond anything seen since the dark days of the Horus heresy. The Golden Throne erupted in blinding radiance as 10 billion souls offered themselves freely to the Emperor's service. Tech Adept Korith watched in awe as readouts that had shown critical failure suddenly blazed with power levels that exceeded all theoretical maximums. The ancient mechanisms, stressed beyond their design limits for 10,000 years, sang with renewed vitality as wave after wave of sacrificial energy poured through the warp. Captain General Trajan Valoris felt the change like a physical blow. The Emperor's presence, which had felt distant and strained since the 17-second silence, suddenly blazed with such intensity that even his enhanced physiology staggered under the psychic pressure. Around the throne chamber, custodian guard who had stood vigil for centuries fell to their knees in spontaneous reverence as their Gene Father's consciousness pressed against reality with godlike force. The effect rippled outward from Terra in concentric waves of pure imperial authority. The warp storm above the throne world didn't merely dissipate. It was burned away by golden fire that turned demon entities into screaming shadows. The rifts throughout the Sol system slammed shut with such force that the psychic backlash could be felt on distant Ultramar. Mars reported that every corrupted machine spirit suddenly purged itself clean, chanting hymns of praise to the Omnissiah in perfect binary harmony. Across the galaxy, astropaths who had survived the initial catastrophe suddenly found their connection to the Astronomican restored with overwhelming intensity. The beacon that guided humanity through the warp now blazed with such brilliance that navigators had to shield their third eyes to avoid blindness. Ships lost in the Imperium for days suddenly found themselves guided home by currents of pure light. On worlds where heretic uprisings had seemed unstoppable, the change was immediate and devastating to the forces of chaos. Cultists who had proclaimed the Emperor's weakness collapsed as waves of divine displeasure crashed over them like tsunami. Demon engines that had terrorized loyal populations for hours simply ceased to exist, their warp-spawned essence unable to maintain cohesion in the face of renewed imperial might. But the true miracle occurred within the deepest vaults of the imperial palace itself. Tech priests monitoring the Golden Throne's most sacred functions detected something impossible: structural regeneration. Components that had been failing for millennia were healing themselves, reinforced by the voluntary sacrifice of humanity's most faithful souls. The Emperor's physical form, that desiccated corpse that had endured 10,000 years of unimaginable suffering, showed the first signs of actual restoration since the Horus heresy. The Astronomican didn't merely return, it evolved. Where once it had been a lighthouse guiding ships through treacherous waters, It now became something far greater, a beacon of absolute imperial authority that reached into every corner of the galaxy. No servant of chaos could hide from its light. No heretic could escape its judgment. No enemy of mankind could claim sanctuary from the Emperor's renewed wrath. The galaxy that emerged from the crisis was forever changed, marked by scars that would never fully heal, but tempered like adamantium in the fires of ultimate sacrifice. On Terra, the Golden Throne hummed with power that surpassed even the dreams of its ancient creators, sustained by the willing sacrifice of 10 billion souls who had chosen faith over fear in humanity's darkest hour. The Emperor's presence, once distant and fading, now blazed with such intensity that even the most distant worlds could feel his watchful gaze. Cardinal Voss stood in the rebuilt Cathedral of St. Catherine, looking out over crowds of pilgrims who had traveled from across the galaxy to witness the sights of miraculous resistance. The faithful spoke in whispers of the 17 seconds when the Emperor had tested them, not through abandonment, but through the ultimate examination of their devotion. Those who had held fast were blessed. Those who had faltered carried shame that would follow them to their graves. In the Strategium of the Macraga's honor, Marneus Calgar reviewed casualty reports that painted a picture of unprecedented loss and miraculous preservation. Entire regiments had vanished during the crisis, not destroyed in battle, but transformed into pure energy to fuel the Emperor's resurrection. Yet their sacrifice had saved billions more, turning certain defeat into the most decisive victory against chaos in 10 millennia. The Space Marines who had participated in the Great Offering found themselves changed in ways they struggled to understand. Master Dante, who had expected death, instead discovered renewed purpose. His ancient body, worn by 15 centuries of constant warfare, showed signs of actual regeneration. The Emperor's blessing flowed through him like liquid fire, granting him strength to face whatever challenges the galaxy might present. Sister Superior Magdalena knelt in prayer before a shrine built from the melted remains of demon weapons, her power armor still bearing scorch marks from the final battle. Around her, the surviving battle sisters spoke of visions during their moment of sacrifice, glimpses of the Emperor's true form, radiant and terrible, judging every soul in the galaxy and finding them worthy of salvation. On Mars, the tech priests worked with renewed fervor to understand the changes wrought in their sacred machines. Every cogitator, every servo skull, every ancient standard template construct now carried traces of divine influence that made them more efficient, more reliable, more perfectly aligned with the Omnissiah's will. The machine spirits sang hymns of praise in binary frequencies that brought tears to even the most augmented tech adepts' eyes. But perhaps the most profound change was in the warp itself. The Astronomican had become something beyond a mere navigational aid. It was now a weapon of such potency that entire demon legions fled at its approach. The Eye of Terra, that wound in reality that had plagued the galaxy for 10,000 years, began showing signs of actual contraction as the Emperor's renewed will pressed against the boundaries of chaos itself. The Imperium that survived the breaking and remaking of the Emperor's will bore little resemblance to the slowly decaying realm that had endured for 10 millennia. Where once there had been stagnation, now there was terrible purpose. Where once there had been doubt, now there was faith refined by the ultimate test. The price of redemption had been paid in the currency of souls. 10 billion of the faithful transformed into pure energy to restore their God-Emperor to power beyond imagining. In the years that followed, imperial scholars would debate the true nature of those 17 seconds when the galaxy held its breath. Some claimed it was divine testing, the Emperor deliberately withdrawing his protection to separate the truly faithful from the merely obedient. Others whispered of darker possibilities, that something ancient and malevolent had briefly touched the Golden Throne, only to be burned away by humanity's collective sacrifice. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere between faith and horror. The Emperor's consciousness, strained beyond endurance by 10,000 years of constant vigilance, had indeed faltered for those crucial moments. In that brief darkness, the worst enemies of mankind had revealed themselves, confident that their ancient foe was finally dying. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Astronomican now blazed with such intensity that astropaths across the galaxy reported visions of golden fire burning away the shadows of the warp. Ships that had been lost for decades suddenly found their way home, guided by currents of pure imperial will. The faithful spoke of miraculous healings, of blessed weapons that never missed their mark, of saints walking among mortals with increasing frequency. But victory had come at a price that would echo through generations. Entire worlds had given their populations to fuel the Emperor's restoration. Chapters of Space Marines had been reduced to mere companies. Orders of the Adepta Sororitas that had served for millennia existed now only in the Emperor's memory, their essence absorbed into his divine consciousness. The galaxy trembled before renewed imperial might, but it also mourned the billions who had chosen eternal service over temporal existence. They were remembered not as casualties of war, but as the ultimate martyrs, those who had willingly stepped into the light to ensure that light would never die again. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, the Golden Throne hummed with contentment, its ancient mechanisms finally functioning as their creators had intended. The master of mankind endured, his will unbroken and his purpose absolute. The Imperium would face whatever darkness lay ahead with renewed faith, for they had learned the ultimate truth. Even when the Emperor's light seems to fail, it burns brightest in the souls of those willing to die for something greater than themselves. The Emperor protects, and sometimes protection requires the ultimate sacrifice. The Emperor protects. More stories await.